Time to get a little history lesson into the world and evolution of 3D. Now, I'm sure many of you might be thinking that 3D is relatively new, and it is in a lot of areas, but the very first 3D rendered animation actually occurred in 1972. Can you believe that? It goes all the way back to the early 70s. And one of the first computer pieces of computer animation was actually done all the way back in 1972, and it was of a hand, as you can see here. And it was done by someone called Ed Catmull, and he was a computer scientist at the University of Utah, and is really known now for being one of the founders of Pixar. Okay, so we've all heard of Pixar. He's one of the big daddies at Pixar there, and you can see that basically how they scanned the hand in was to actually have a physical mold of the hand, and the hand was actually Ed Catmull's, and they'd make little lines and basically connect it almost like a polygon, like they draw on where the polygons would be and scanned it into the computer. And once they scanned the model into the computer, they added shading and stuff like that, and then they started manipulating, could animate that mesh that they scanned into that computer. And just really, really crazy stuff, these wireframes that they're scanning in there. And then they ended up doing faces along the way. And a little trivia tip for you is Ed Catmull. Catmull's name is actually, if you create a subdivision surface object in Cinema 4D, one of the smoothing methods is actually named for Ed Catmull, because he was one of the pioneers of 3D. So I mentioned that you actually would scan 3D objects into a computer, and there was something called Scanimate, which is like the very first machine that could create motion graphics. Think of like the very first 3D like HBO logo and stuff like that. And here's a few examples of just very simple 3D and wireframes and stuff like that. And these were the first 3D motion graphics back in the 70s and 80s, okay? And these little wireframes actually inspired a lot of movie graphics and stuff like that. If you think back to in 1977, Star Wars, the original Star Wars, and I always love the sequence where they show the rebels, the Death Star and the plans of the Death Star and how to do the bombing run, and it was all 3D wireframe, and that always stood out to me as being such a really cool thing, and especially I'm sure was a really cool thing at the time in 1977 to have all these 3D wireframes to visualize one of the key points of the scene. It was just such a cool thing, and actually these graphics here, these 3D wireframes, actually inspire a lot of what we see today in movies, and I think of Marvel movies that jumps to mind immediately with all of the 3D HUD stuff. And when I say 3D HUD, a lot of people immediately think of like Iron Man and the heads-up displays and that whole world of FUI, or fantasy user interface, or fake user interface. This was kind of, the start, and especially of like in Tron as well, back in the 1970s as well, the very first Tron. So as technology was kind of being developed and improved and catching up to, what artists envision, things started to change. And it's funny because actually it was until 1990. 1990 was actually the very first Cinema 4D version that came out on the scene. So 1990, that's crazy. It's 28 years old, right? And you can see how how old the interface looks and stuff like that. And like you can see all the little spline tools and the interface, and man, if you think the interface looks a little bit daunting now, just look at what you had back then. Just to be able to move things around in 3D space was a little bit of a chore. But it's just so interesting to see how far even software kind of evolved to where it is now, to where you're using Cinema 4D and there's a lot more buttons, right? So let's actually skip ahead. So that's 1990. First Cinema 4D version came out, and actually didn't even come out for Windows or Mac first. It was actually came out for a computer system called Amiga, which is crazy. But skip ahead to 1995, where you have the very first fully 3D feature film little movie called Toy Story. And again, Pixar, right? So Ed Catmull's working on this behind the scenes along with all the really crazy, smart computer scientists to then create the very first feature-length 3D film. And if you're like me, I remember seeing this when, I was about 14 years old or something like that, and it blew me away. Like, it was so cool to see where Pixar is even now, and it's just nuts, right? Like, the films just look so beautiful, and I think even looking at this, I don't know how well it holds up, to be honest, and this is, 13 years ago. So it's crazy how our eye for 3D has improved so much just because of the quality level of what we see in 3D these days. So I feel like mainstream 3D use didn't really occur until the last 10 years or so. Again, with technology making more advances. And I think specifically Cinema 4D, because I think up until Cinema 4D got released and they introduced some new MoGraph tools that we'll actually cover later in the class. But these things were game changers as far as bringing the learning curve way down to entering the world of 3D and using it as more of a design tool rather than what 3D was used as, which was primarily for heavy VFX users and not exactly for like designers or illustrators. In Cinema 4D, adding their integration with After Effects was, I think, one of the biggest game-changing things in the world of 3D to make 3D more accessible for designers and for motion graphics artists, which motion graphics was just a concept that just kind of popped out of the scene, about, maybe 20 years ago, maybe even less than that, right? So 3D is being used as more of a design tool today. And some of the first design studios to start intermingling and mixing traditional After Effects 2D work with 3D were some studios that are still making amazing stuff to this day. And one of the major ones is MK12. And they kind of burst onto the scene and got really popular with their piece called Man of Action, which actually came out in the year 2000, which is crazy. And they actually just recently came up with a sequel to this Man of Action that is just amazing that you guys, if you haven't seen it, check it out. But it kind of made the web, or made the turns on the web a long time ago. But I love this little monkey guy. They made him toon shaded with Sketch and Toon in Cinema 4D, and you can see how a lot of this is just 2D After Effects work, and they integrated 3D assets from time to time, right? So that was kind of the first implementation of 3D, was not full 3D pieces, but traditional After Effects 2D animation, adding little 3D accents here and there. Another really great example, and it also harkens back to the Star Wars with the wireframes, and that is the opening to IT Crowd, which was a British comedy, came out in 2006, and this was done by Shinola. And I just love this sequence. They're mixing the little 8-bit 2D characters with the 3D wireframe environment, and I just really, really love it. So another example of maybe a more fully 3D world, but using 2D elements. And then the next example is this piece from PSYOP from 2008. Another example of how even between that 2000 MK12 piece that I showed you, this is 8 years later, and just see how much more advanced this looks. And it's in HD as well. But you have these really crazy, highly detailed, stylized 3D crows, which are really nice and rigged up. And we're combining them with these flocks of crows, and they turn into, and they're composited into all of these 3D trees kind of growing throughout here. And it's just really, really awesome stylized piece. And again, another example of this was probably Sketch and Toon in Cinema 4D, where Sketch and Toon was utilized a lot, 10 years ago. And again, a lot of compositing done in After Effects. So let's move on to something that was just 2 years later. And this piece is, you might have seen this before, but it's called Pixels by Patrick Jean. And this is a good piece that shows like a one-man band being able to composite this 3D footage of all these kind of 3D pixelated characters. We've got Pac-Man and stuff like that kind of taking over New York City. and everything that gets touched by all these 8-bit objects get turned into these little pixelated pieces, which is really, really cool. And this just goes to show how easy it was in 2010 for a one-man band to kind of produce this all by themselves. And skip ahead to 2016, just a couple of years ago, where we have something like Beeple. And we all know Beeple, he's crazy, he's amazingly talented, but this is about the time where third-party renderers really started proliferating and made rendering look super realistic and allowed an artist, a singular artist, to be able to render something very lifelike, hyper-real, very fast, and create something as beautiful like this, again, with a one-man band. So the 3D accessibility has just really grown, and this is a piece by my buddy David Ariev, who created this in, like a month or so, and it's this full-length music video. He did all the compositing, everything in this, all the rendering, and it was the advancements in all the technologies over the past few years, and even from year to year now, there's so many new advancements where something like this piece would have taken like an entire team of compositors, of animators, of renderers. All of this would have taken an entire studio maybe like a couple months to do, to the point now where David took about a month to probably all by himself animate, composite, and render all this stuff. So a few weeks for one guy to, compared to a few months in an entire studio of people, maybe if this was made in like 2010 or something like that. So you can just see this awesome progression of how far 3D's kind of come from the early 2000s, even the early 2000s to now, and that's 18 years, right? So it's so crazy how far we've come, where everything now, the style is kind of like very hyper realistic and stuff like that. And I just think it's such an amazing time to be in this field, because with the recent advances, broadcast TV is not the only venue. It's not the only canvas for 3D artists anymore. We have AR, we have VR, we have projection mapping. Here I have something from the Sydney Opera House, which is massive, and you see all of these really amazing 3D projections projected onto this massive structure. And this is becoming another huge thing as well. The projection mapping, AR, VR. It's going to be really interesting to see where 3D kind of takes us in 10 more years, right? Things are going to get nuts. But the thing to keep in mind, and the thing that you can bank on for sure, is that there's never been a time where 3D is being used as much. And there's never been a time where 3D is more accessible than it is right now. So there's never been a better time to learn. So good on you for joining up to this class, because I think it's really going to be huge for you to keep up with the advances, because I think more and more people aren't going to be able to get by without learning some amount of 3D. So again, good on you for signing up to this class and equipping yourself with a skill that is going to be more and more and more and more in demand in the future. So it's better late than never, right?